On the 14th of February 1943, 12 American Marine pilots took off from Guadalcanal in the most powerful single-engine fighter the United States had ever built. 2 hours later, 2 of their Corsairs had been shot down. 6 other American aircraft had been torn apart by Japanese Zeros. And 10 American airmen, Marine, Army, and Navy would never see another sunrise. The fighter they had flown, the 400-mile-per-hour wonder weapon the Marine Corps had promised would dominate the Pacific, had just suffered the worst defeat any American fighter would ever take on its first day of combat. That fighter was the F4U Corsair. The press never reported the losses. The Marine Corps classified the after-action report. The American public would not learn the truth for nearly 2 years. And what happened in the 11 months that followed, how a beaten aircraft became the deadliest fighter of the Pacific War, is one of the great untold stories of the Second World War. To understand how it happened, we have to begin 12 years after the war ended, at a small desk in Tokyo, where a half-blind Japanese veteran finally sat down to write the truth. His name was Saburo Sakai. He had been one of the men on the other side of that February morning, and the truth, he discovered, was complicated. In 1941, the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy were the finest naval aviators the world had ever produced. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter so agile, so fast, so deadly that Allied pilots were ordered never to engage it in a turning fight. At Pearl Harbor, 9 Zeros were lost while American aircraft burned by the hundreds. Over the Philippines, Zero pilots claimed 550 Allied aircraft destroyed in the first week of war. Over Ceylon, by Japanese accounts, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida watched dozens of British planes spiral into the Indian Ocean for the loss of only a handful of his own. The kill ratios were intoxicating. 10 to 1, 15 to 1, sometimes higher. A young warrant officer named Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, 23 years old, with quiet eyes and a chronic case of malaria he never reported, wrote to his younger brother in February of 1943. He told him the Zero was a perfect weapon. He told him it harmonized with the pilot's spirit like a samurai's sword. He told him the Americans built flying trucks, heavy, clumsy, without soul. He was not lying. In February of 1943 he had no reason to lie. Nagoya, Japan. Mitsubishi Aircraft Works. The man at the drafting table was 39 years old, and he was very tired. Jiro Horikoshi had designed the Zero. He had also designed it knowing exactly what it could not survive. To make the Zero turn faster than any Western fighter, he had stripped weight from every component of the aircraft. He had removed armor plating from the pilot's seat. He had eliminated self-sealing fuel tanks. He had used a thinner aluminum alloy that cracked under stress an American wing would absorb. He had given his country a fighter that danced in the sky. He had also given them a fighter that burned. When asked years later why he made these choices, Horikoshi did not flinch. "I designed a fighter for a nation that lacked resources," he would say. It was an elegant solution to poverty. In 1943, poverty had not yet caught up with Japan. It was coming. Stratford, Connecticut, May 29, 1940. A test pilot named Lyman Bullard climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft that should not have existed. It was called the XF4U-1. It was the prototype of the F4U Corsair, designed by Chance Vought to meet a US Navy request from 1938. The Navy had asked for a fighter capable of 260 miles per hour. Vaught's chief designer Rex Basel ignored them. He had built something faster. The XF4U-1 was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine producing nearly 2,000 horsepower. It was the largest aero engine ever bolted to a single-engine fighter. To swing the enormous 13-foot propeller without scraping the runway, Basel had bent the wings downward in an inverted gull configuration that would become the Corsair's signature silhouette. Bullard pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft moved. Then it leapt. On the 1st of October 1940, an early variant of the XF4U-1 became the first American single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Navy had asked for 260. Vought had delivered 405. There was only one problem. The Corsair could not land on a carrier. The long nose blocked the pilot's view forward during approach. The landing gear bounced violently on impact with the deck. The stall behavior during slow flight was unforgiving and sudden. The first carrier qualification trials in 1942 were a disaster. Corsairs porpoising down the flight deck, snapping arrestor cables, crashing into deck barriers, the US. Navy made a decision that would later seem almost comical. They rejected the Corsair. The fastest single-engine fighter in the American arsenal, the aircraft built specifically for carrier operations, was deemed unsuitable for the very mission it had been designed for. The Navy sent it away. They gave it to the Marines. In December of 1942, the 1st Marine Fighting Squadron began transitioning to the new aircraft. They were called VMF-124. Their commanding officer was a Marine Major named William E. Gies, a quiet, methodical man in his mid-30s with no combat experience and very little time to acquire any. The Pacific was burning. Guadalcanal had been bleeding American Marines for months. The Japanese held Rabaul, the largest air complex in the South Pacific, with hundreds of Zeros and the best pilots Japan had left. Gies had 8 weeks to learn his aircraft. On February 12, 1943, VMF-124 landed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Corsairs, 22 of them, taxied past the wreckage of Japanese Bettys and the burned-out hulks of American Wildcats. The Marines on the ground stared at them. No one had seen anything like them. The bent wings, the huge cowling, the long, hungry nose, the strange, whistling shriek that came from the wing root air intakes when the Corsair dove. Japanese pilots, who would learn that sound very soon, would give the aircraft a nickname, Whistling Death. In English, it sounded like poetry. In Japanese, it sounded like prophecy. February 14, 1943. The skies above New Georgia. The mission was a routine bomber escort. 2 PB-4Y Liberators were to strike Japanese shipping near the Shortland Islands, screened by a mixed fighter force, 10 P-38 Lightnings from the Army Air Force, 8 P-40 Warhawks from a fighter group on Guadalcanal, and 12 F4U Corsairs from VMF-124. The Corsairs were flying their first combat sortie. Most of their pilots had less than 50 hours in the aircraft. They climbed through scattered cloud to 20,000 feet. They saw the Japanese before the Japanese saw them. 50 Zeros, possibly more, rising from Kahili Airfield in a coordinated swarm, vectored by ground controllers, climbing fast on the thermal lift that only the Zero could exploit at altitude. Behind them, a smaller force of Japanese bombers shadowed the engagement, hunting for the Liberators. The Americans had been told the Corsair could outperform the Zero in any condition. The Americans had been lied to. The fight lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, 2 Corsairs were gone, 2 P-40s, 2 P-38s. Both PB-4Y Liberators had been shot to pieces and went down with their crews. 8 American aircraft destroyed in less than 20 minutes. The Japanese lost 3 Zeros and several bombers from a separate part of the engagement. The Americans called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. They classified the after-action report. They suppressed the loss figures from the press for months. The Corsair, the wonder weapon, the 400-mile-per-hour answer to the Zero, had been beaten in its first true combat. VMF-124's pilots returned to Henderson Field in silence. Major Gies walked alone to the squadron tent and did not speak for nearly an hour. 3 months later, on the 13th of May, he would be dead, killed in a dogfight over the Russell Islands, never seeing the aircraft he had brought to the Pacific become the killer everyone had promised it would be. What they did not know, what they could not yet know, was that the loss was not the story. The loss was the lesson. Rabaul, Japanese Naval Air Headquarters. February 15, 1943. A flight officer reviewed the combat reports from the previous day. The kill claims were impressive. Japanese pilots had reported destroying as many as 40 Allied aircraft in the engagement, a wildly inflated figure typical of wartime overclaiming on every side of the war. Actual American losses were significant, but only a fraction of what had been claimed. The morale at Rabaul was high. Buried inside one report was a single, troubling section. A petty officer had described an American fighter he did not recognize. He had written that it had bent wings. He had written that it dove faster than any Allied aircraft he had ever pursued. He had written that when he tried to follow it down in a steep dive, his Zero's control surfaces had frozen above 350 miles per hour. and he had been unable to bring his guns to bear before the American fighter pulled away beneath him. He had written that the new American fighter was unlike anything in their briefings. He had written that the Zero could not stay with it. He had written that they had been told things about American aircraft that were no longer true. The flight officer read the section twice. Then he set the report aside and did nothing. In his memoir, Saburo Sakai would write that the Imperial Japanese Navy in early 1943 was an institution that had stopped listening. The reports were filtering in. The technical analyses were arriving. The young petty officers and warrant officers who were dying over the Solomons were sending back the same message in 100 different forms. The American fighter was new. The American fighter was different. The American fighter could not be defeated by the tactics that had won every battle from Pearl Harbor to Singapore. But the admirals at Rabaul and the planners in Tokyo had built their war on a single faith. They believed that Japanese pilots, trained for 4 years in the most rigorous naval aviation program in the world, would always overcome any technological gap through skill, through spirit, through the unity of man and machine that Nishizawa had described in his letter to his brother. They were about to discover that Spirit cannot outclimb a Pratt and Whitney R2800. They were about to discover that warrior tradition cannot outrun 2,000 horsepower. They were about to discover that the F4U Corsair, the aircraft their own intelligence officers were now quietly calling the bent-winged American, had not lost the fight on St. Valentine's Day. It had only introduced itself. The introduction was over. The lesson was about to begin. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, March 1943. The hangars smelled of aviation fuel and volcanic dust. The mechanics were learning the Corsair the way a man learns a complicated woman, through trial, through error, through wreckage on the runway and silence at breakfast. There was a young first lieutenant in VMF 124 named Kenneth Ambrose Walsh. He was 26 years old. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18 as an aviation mechanic, scrubbing oil out of the cowlings of biplanes in the years before the war. He had earned his wings the hard way, the slow way, the way the old Corps had still made men earn them. He was quiet. He was methodical. He did not drink with the other pilots. He had also studied the after-action reports from the 14th of February. Walsh understood something that the briefings had refused to say out loud. The Corsair could not turn with a Zero, not at low altitude, not at low speed, not in any condition that a samurai-trained pilot would choose to fight in. To turn with a Zero in a low-speed dogfight was to die in a low-speed dogfight. The Corsair could do something else. It could dive faster. It could climb faster from altitude. It could absorb punishment that the Zero's tissue paper airframe could not even imagine. It could fire 650 caliber Browning machine guns for nearly 30 seconds before the ammunition cans ran dry. Walsh worked out the math on the back of a mission card. You climbed above the Japanese formations. You came down on them at 400 miles per hour. You fired during a single high-speed pass. You did not turn. You did not slow down. You did not look back. You used the energy of the dive to climb back up to altitude, and you did it again, and you did it again, until they were dead or you were out of ammunition. They would call it boom and zoom. It was a tactic born from a humiliation. It would change the Pacific. On the 1st of April, 1943, Kenneth Walsh shot down his first Zero over the Russell Islands. He killed 2 more on the 13th of May, on the same day that Major William Guise was bounced by Zero formation east of New Georgia and shot down into the sea. Guise's body was never recovered. The man who had brought the Corsair to Guadalcanal, who had walked the silent walk to the squadron tent after the St. Valentine's Day defeat, died without ever seeing his aircraft become the killer he had promised the Marine Corps it would be. He had commanded VMF 124 for 9 months. He had given them their tactics. He had given them their discipline. The Corsair would carry his men through to victory. He would never know. By the end of May, Walsh had 8 confirmed kills. By August, he had more than a dozen. On the 15th and the 30th of that month, attacking Japanese formations near Vella La Vella, he would perform actions so reckless and so successful that he would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States can bestow on a man. He attacked alone. He attacked outnumbered. He attacked at low altitude after his wingman's aircraft had been shot to pieces and his own engine was running rough on fouled plugs. On the second engagement, he ditched his Corsair in the ocean with his cowling on fire and was pulled out of the water by a passing destroyer. He was 26 years old. He was a Marine. He had become the first ace in the F4U Corsair. On the 1st of April, the same day Walsh scored his first kill, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto launched the largest air offensive the Imperial Japanese Navy had attempted since Midway. He called it Operation Igo. He sent more than 200 aircraft, including over 100 Zeros, against Allied positions at Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, Oro Bay, Port Moresby, and Milne Bay. He wanted to break the back of Allied air power in the South Pacific. He did not break it. The Japanese lost dozens of aircraft and irreplaceable pilots in 2 weeks of fighting. The Allied losses were significant but absorbable. The Corsairs of VMF 124 and now of VMF 213, VMF 221, VMF 122, all of them converting to the new aircraft, were learning. They were getting faster. They were getting smarter. They were no longer the green pilots of February. On the 18th of April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M bomber to fly an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomons. American codebreakers had read his itinerary, 18 P-38 Lightnings, not Corsairs, but the Army Air Force's twin-engine answer to the long-range fighter problem, climbed off Henderson Field and flew more than 400 miles in radio silence. They intercepted Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville. They shot it down into the jungle. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy buried him with full state honors and did not announce his death to the Japanese public for more than a month. In Tokyo, the silence in the Navy Ministry was the silence of men who were beginning to understand that something had changed. Their reports from the Solomons were now arriving with regularity. New American fighters, heavier American fighters, faster American fighters. The Zero was still the best dogfighter in the Pacific. The dogfight was no longer the war. In September of 1943, a 30-year-old Marine major arrived at Espiritu Santo to take command of a newly formed fighter squadron. His name was Gregory Boyington. The men he was to command would call him Pappy because he was a decade older than most of them. The press would later call him a hero. The newsreels would build him into a legend. The television series that would be made about him 30 years after the war, Bar 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 Black Sheep, starring Robert Conrad, would turn him into something he never was. The truth about Gregory Boyington was something else. He had been born in Idaho in 1912. He had grown up rough. He had drunk hard since he was a teenager. He had married young, fathered 3 children, and failed at being a husband to his wife or a father to his children. He had joined the Marine Corps as an aviator before the war, washed out of his first peacetime assignment for indebtedness and conduct, and then in 1941 he had taken a job with a private military contractor in China. That contractor was the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. Boyington flew P-40 Warhawks for Claire Chennault in Burma and southern China during the first months of 1942. He claimed several kills, though the records would later be contested. He brawled with fellow pilots in the squadron mess. He drank himself into stupors that lasted days. He borrowed money from the Chinese government, a substantial sum, by some accounts, and never paid it back. By April of 1942, Chennault had had enough. Boyington left the Flying Tigers under pressure. His departure was not honorable. He came back to the United States in disgrace. He drank his way through the summer of 1942. At one point, broken and broke, he sat in a hotel room in Seattle with a service pistol on the table and considered ending his own life. He did not end it. He got himself recommissioned in the Marine Corps in late 1942 because the Marine Corps was short on pilots and could not afford to be choosy about a man's history. He was given a desk job. He volunteered repeatedly for combat. In August of 1943, he was finally given command of a squadron of leftover replacement pilots, men who did not belong to any other unit, and told to make a fighter squadron out of them. He named them the Black Sheep. He led them on their first combat patrol on the 14th of September 1943. They scored their first aerial victories 2 days later. The legend of Pappy Boyington was about to be born. The man who would create that legend was a 30-year-old recovering alcoholic with a history of debt, scandal, and a discharge that nobody in the press corps would learn about for another 20 years. War is a strange machine. It does not care who builds the heroes, it only cares that they are built. In late October of 1943, a second F4U Corsair squadron of historic importance entered the Pacific. They were Navy, not Marine. They were called VF-17. They flew from a forward base on Ondonga Island under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, a 31-year-old Annapolis graduate with the cold, analytical mind of a chess player. Blackburn was nothing like Boyington. He did not drink to excess, he did not gamble, he ran his squadron like a graduate seminar in aerial combat. His pilots painted skulls and crossbones on the noses of their Corsairs. They called themselves the Jolly Rogers. For the next 4 months, the Black Sheep and the Jolly Rogers would fight the Japanese over the same patch of ocean, the patch that included Bougainville, the Shortlands, New Britain, and at the center of it all, the great Japanese fortress of Rabaul. Rabaul. The word even now carries weight for any man who studied the Pacific War. It was the largest Japanese air complex the South Pacific. It contained 5 airfields, hundreds of aircraft, the headquarters of the 11th Air Fleet, and the finest naval aviators Japan had left. It was the citadel from which Japan had launched its conquest of the South Pacific, and by the autumn of 1943 it had become the place where the Imperial Japanese Navy was sending its sons to die. On the 11th of November 1943, carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 struck Rabaul's harbour and airfields. They damaged 6 Japanese cruisers. They destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground. The Corsairs that flew that strike, flying from marine airfields on Bougainville and from Navy carriers offshore, encountered Zero formations that no longer fought the way Zero formations had fought in 1942. They no longer attacked aggressively, they no longer pressed home their advantages, they engaged briefly and disengaged and tried to survive. Inside Rabaul, in a wooden barracks east of Lakunai Airfield, a Japanese warrant officer named Tetsuzo Iwamoto kept a journal. He was 27 years old. He had flown Zeros over China since 1938. He had served aboard the carrier Zuikaku during the Battle of the Coral Sea. He was, by any honest measure, the finest fighter pilot Japan still possessed. He would claim more aerial victories than any other Imperial Japanese Navy pilot of the entire war. He wrote in small, careful handwriting, in a notebook he kept hidden in his footlocker. In late November of 1943, he wrote a sentence that no Japanese naval officer would have written in 1942. He wrote that the Zero could no longer engage the new American fighter in a direct contest. He wrote that the bent-winged American could choose when to fight and when to leave. He wrote that a Japanese pilot could only catch a Corsair if the Corsair chose to be caught. He wrote that the war in the air was no longer being won by pilots. It was being won by engineers. Years after the war, when American naval intelligence analysts began going through Corsair combat reports in detail, they would discover something uncomfortable. A significant percentage of the Zero kills claimed by Corsair pilots in 1943 and 1944 had not been Zeros at all. They had been Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars. The Ki-43 was an Army aircraft, not a Navy aircraft. It looked very similar to the Zero from a distance. Single radial engine, low-mounted wings, lightweight construction. To a Corsair pilot flashing past a Japanese fighter at 400 miles per hour in a high-deflection gunnery pass, the two were nearly indistinguishable. The technical intelligence officers of the United States Navy, reviewing gun camera footage in 1946, estimated that 20 to 30% of Zero kills claimed in the South Pacific had actually been Oscars from the Imperial Japanese Army. This did not change the outcome of the war. It did not diminish the courage of the men who fought it. It did mean that the famous 11-to-1 kill ratio of the Corsair over the Zero, a figure that has appeared in nearly every popular history of the Pacific War, was, in a strictly technical sense, an exaggeration. The Corsair did win, the Zero did lose, but the margin was narrower than the post-war press had told the American public. This is what honest history looks like. It is messier than the legends. It is more interesting than the legends. And the men who flew the Corsairs, the men who climbed into the cockpit at 4 o'clock in the morning over Espiritu Santo and Ondonga, the men who took off into the dark over the Solomon Sea, not knowing whether they would land again, those men did not need the legends. They knew what they had done. That was enough. The deepest secret of the Pacific Air War, the one that nobody on either side wanted to admit at the time, was that the Corsair did not defeat the Zero on its own terms. The Corsair defeated the Zero after the Zero had already been crippled by something invisible. Japan was running out of pilots. The pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy aviation training program had been one of the most selective in the world. A young man entering the program at the age of 15 or 16 would face a 95% washout rate. Those who survived emerged after 4 years as fighter pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time, gunnery skill, formation discipline, and combat readiness comparable to anything in the world. The program produced about 100 pilots per year. 100. In June of 1942, at Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost more than 100 of its most experienced naval aviators in a single afternoon. The math was already over. By the time the Corsair arrived at Henderson Field in February of 1943, Japan was already replacing its dead pilots with men who had received perhaps 150 hours of training. By the middle of 1943, that number had fallen to 100 hours. By 1944, some Japanese fighter pilots would be sent into combat with 60 hours total flight time, less than what a Marine cadet logged before he was permitted to fly his first solo in a primary trainer at Pensacola. Meanwhile, in Pensacola, Florida, and Corpus Christi, Texas, and a dozen other naval air stations across the southern United States, the United States Navy was commissioning newly winged aviators at a rate of more than 2,000 a month. Each one of them had over 600 hours of training before he reached the front. The Corsair did not defeat the Zero. The American school system defeated the Japanese school system. The Pratt & Whitney engine simply finished off what the math classroom had already done. In the spring of 1944, a tall, lean civilian aviation consultant arrived in the Pacific Theater of Operations. He was 42 years old. His name was Charles Augustus Lindbergh. The men in the Pacific knew exactly who he was. He was the man who had flown the Atlantic alone in 1927. He was the man who had become, briefly, the most famous human being on Earth. He was also the man who, in the years before Pearl Harbor, had stood at the head of the America First Committee and told the American people that the United States should stay out of the war in Europe. He had been called a Nazi sympathizer in the press. He had been stripped of his Army Air Corps commission. He had been disgraced. Now, in 1944, Lindbergh wanted back in. He could not be commissioned. The political damage was too deep, but he could be sent to the Pacific as a civilian technical consultant for the United Aircraft Corporation, which built the Pratt & Whitney engines that powered both the F4U Corsair and the P-38 Lightning. He carried a clipboard, he carried credentials, he carried no rank, he also carried a service pistol. In a series of quiet arrangements between Marine and Army Air Force commanders in the Pacific, commanders who admired the man and pitied the disgrace, Charles Lindbergh was permitted to fly combat missions. Not officially, never officially, but the records, declassified decades after the war, would show that he flew approximately 50 combat sorties over New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies in 1944. The majority were in P-38 Lightnings with the Army's 475th Fighter Group. A smaller number were in F4U Corsairs with Marine fighter squadrons, including VMF-216 and VMF-222. On the 28th of July 1944, flying a P-38 over Seram Island in the Dutch East Indies, Lindbergh shot down a Japanese Army Ki-51 reconnaissance plane. The kill was never officially credited to him. It could not be. He was a civilian. But the man who had once stood on stages and begged America not to fight, the man whose face had been on isolationist posters across the United States in the months before Pearl Harbor, had now killed a Japanese soldier in air combat, alone at 400 miles per hour, somewhere over the Banda Sea. He also taught the Corsair pilots something invaluable. He taught them how to lean their fuel mixtures. He taught them how to set their propeller pitch and throttle settings for maximum range. He showed them that the F4U, properly handled by a patient pilot, could fly nearly twice as far as the Marine flight manuals claimed. In doing so, he gave the Marines a strategic weapon. A Corsair could now reach targets that the Japanese had assumed were beyond American range. That was a problem for the Japanese. That was the end of any safe place left in the South Pacific. By September of 1944, Rabaul was a graveyard. The Imperial Japanese Navy had withdrawn its surviving aircraft from the fortress in February. The airfields were cratered, the hangars were empty shells. The harbour, which had once held the proudest warships of the combined fleet, had become a cemetery of half-sunk hulls. The Black Sheep had flown their last combat tour. Pappy Boyington was missing in action, presumed dead, last seen diving on a zero formation over St. George's Channel on the 3rd of January 1944. The Jolly Rogers had been rotated home in March. Tetsuzo Iwamoto was still alive, still flying, still keeping his journal. He had begun writing his entries in a kind of personal shorthand because he no longer trusted that any Japanese reader after the war would understand what he had seen. Saburo Sakai, half-blind, was back in combat, flying with the Yokosuka Air Group, one of the last veteran pilot units the Empire still possessed. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa had 38 days left to live. The Corsair had become, by every measurement, the most lethal carrier-based fighter in the world, and the worst was still ahead. The Japanese Empire was not finished, it was only cornered. And cornered animals do the strangest things. Soon in October, in a wooden conference room at a Philippine airfield, a 53-year-old vice admiral named Takejiro Onishi was to gather his pilots together and tell them what no admiral in any navy had ever told his men before. He was going to tell them to crash their aircraft into American ships. The kamikaze era was about to begin. The Corsair pilots, the men who thought they had seen everything the air war could do to a human being, were about to see something that no pilot, on any side of any war, had ever been asked to face before. That story is the final act. The 3rd of January 1944, St. George's Channel. 48 Corsairs from VMF-214, VMF-211 and VF-17 were flying high cover for a strike on Rabaul. The sky was clear. The Japanese, who had been told to engage only with overwhelming numerical superiority, came up anyway. Major Gregory Boyington dove on a zero at 20,000 feet. He fired. He hit something. He called the kill out over the radio. What he believed was his 26th aerial victory, the score that would have made him the leading American ace of the Pacific War. Then he disappeared. His wingman saw him chase another zero into a cloud bank. His wingman never saw him come out. For the next 20 months, Gregory Boyington, Pappy, the recovering alcoholic, the man who had once stood with a service pistol in a Seattle hotel room and chosen not to use it, was officially listed as missing in action. His wife in California received a telegram. The Marine Corps held a small ceremony. The newspapers wrote obituaries. The Marine Corps recommended him for the Medal of Honor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt approved the award in March of 1944. The citation was filed. The medal was struck. It sat in a box in Washington, waiting for a ceremony that nobody could schedule, because the man for whom it had been struck was presumed to be at the bottom of St. George's Channel. He was not at the bottom of St. George's Channel. He was in a Japanese prison camp. After bailing out of his burning Corsair, Boyington had been pulled from the water by a Japanese submarine that happened to be patrolling the area. He had been wounded, he had been beaten, he had been moved from one prison facility to another, finally ending up at Omori, a labor camp on a small artificial island in Tokyo Bay. The Japanese knew exactly who he was. They did not tell the Red Cross. They wanted him invisible. He was invisible for 20 months. 6 weeks after Boyington vanished, the Imperial Japanese Navy did something its admirals had once sworn it would never do. It abandoned Rabaul. The remaining aircraft were flown out, 300 of them, then 200, then a handful of stragglers. The hangars were stripped, the headquarters was reduced. The greatest Japanese fortress in the South Pacific was ceded to the Allied advance, not because it had been overrun, but because there were no longer enough trained pilots to defend it. The Black Sheep were already gone, so were the Jolly Rogers, so was Major G's, sleeping in the Pacific. The Corsair squadrons that had broken Rabaul had paid for the victory and gone home. What remained at Rabaul was the ghost of an empire that had once believed in the unity of man and machine. The machine had failed, the men had not. The math had simply run out. On the 19th and 20th of June 1944, the United States Navy met what was left of Japanese naval aviation in the open Pacific west of the Mariana Islands. The Japanese sent more than 400 carrier aircraft into the battle. They were flown by pilots with 100 hours of training. They were intercepted by Grumman F-6F Hellcats and shot to pieces. The Americans called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The cold name was earned. By sunset on the second day, Japanese naval aviation as a force capable of contesting the Pacific had simply ceased to exist. On the 26th of October 1944, in the sky between Cebu and Mindoro in the Philippines, a Japanese transport aircraft was intercepted by Grumman Hellcats from Navy Fighter Squadron VF-14. The transport was a Showa L-2D, the Japanese license-built version of the American Douglas DC-3, given the Allied codename Tabby. It was old, it was slow, it carried no defensive armament. It was in fact the kind of aircraft that civilian Japanese airlines had flown across peaceful skies before the war, and the cruel irony, lost on the American pilots who shot it down, was that it had been built in Japan under license from an American company in Long Beach, California. The Hellcats made a single firing pass. The Tabby fell into the jungle. There were no survivors. On board, listed on the passenger manifest as a fleet replacement traveling to pick up new aircraft, was Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. He was 24 years old. He had been credited by his own claims and by Japanese naval records with 87 aerial victories, more than any other Imperial Japanese Navy pilot of the war. He had survived 200 dogfights. He had outlived nearly every man he had ever flown with. He had been promised that he would be transferred to instructor duty, away from the front, where his experience could be used to train the desperate new pilots Japan was now throwing into the air with 100 hours of flying time. He never reached his destination. The greatest Japanese fighter ace of the Pacific War did not die in a dogfight with a Corsair. He did not die at the controls of a Zero. He did not die the way the legends would later try to write him. He died as a passenger. He died in a transport plane. He died because some Navy lieutenant in a Hellcat, whose name has not been recorded by history, made a routine pass on a slow-moving target and walked away never knowing what he had done. There is no glory in that. There is only war. The day before Nishizawa's death, the 25th of October 1944, a 23-year-old lieutenant named Yukio Seki took off from Mabalacat airfield on the island of Luzon. He was flying a Mitsubishi A6M0. Under his fuselage was a 250-kilogram bomb. He had no intention of landing. A week earlier, in a wooden conference room at Mabalacat, a 53-year-old vice admiral named Takijiro Onishi had gathered the surviving fighter pilots of the 1st Air Fleet and explained that conventional attacks were no longer producing meaningful results. Japan would lose every aircraft it possessed in a year of conventional combat and inflict almost no damage on the American fleet. Onishi proposed a different approach. He proposed that pilots fly their aircraft directly into American ships. In English, the word that would survive in the world's memory was a single Japanese word, kamikaze, the divine wind. The typhoon that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion 7 centuries earlier. Seki was chosen to lead the first official mission. He had been married for 4 months. The night before he flew, he gave a quiet interview to a Japanese newspaper correspondent. The translation is uncertain, but the meaning is clear. He said that Japan's future was bleak if it had been reduced to ordering its best pilots to die. He said that he was not going on this mission for the emperor. He said that he was not going on this mission for the empire. He said that he was going because he had been ordered to. The next morning, off the coast of Samar, Yukio Seki crashed his Zero into the flight deck of the United States Navy escort carrier USS St. Lo. The bomb detonated below the deck. The fuel tanks went up. The St. Lo sank in less than half an hour, carrying more than 100 American sailors with her to the bottom. The kamikaze era had begun. It would last 10 more months, it would kill more than 3,000 Japanese pilots, and every one of those pilots, every one of them, climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft that the Corsair had already defeated in technical terms, an aircraft from a generation of warplanes that the United States Navy was no longer afraid of. The bravery did not save them. The bravery could not save them. There was no bravery left in the world that could overcome a Pratt & Whitney R-2800. On the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast on Japanese radio for the first time in history. The empire had accepted unconditional surrender. The war was over. That night, Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi went home to his official residence in Tokyo. He wrote 2 letters. One was to his wife. The other was to the families of the kamikaze pilots, the 4,000 young men whom he had personally sent to die in the previous 10 months. He apologized. Then he committed seppuku, ritual suicide with a short sword. He did it badly, on purpose. He cut himself, then refused medical attention. He lay on the floor of his study and bled for 15 hours before he died on the 17th of August. It was, he believed, the only honorable response to what he had ordered. 12 days later, on the 29th of August 1945, American Marines walked through the gates of Omori prison camp on Tokyo Bay. They found Gregory Boyington alive. He was malnourished. He was sick. He was wearing a Japanese prisoner's tunic. His leg had never healed properly from the wounds he had taken when he bailed out over St. George's Channel. He was 32 years old. He weighed 112 pounds. He blinked at the American officer standing in front of him and asked, very quietly, whether the war was really over. The officer told him that it was. Boyington wept. In October of 1945, in a ceremony at the White House, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Boyington's neck, a medal that had been struck 18 months earlier in the belief that he was already dead. He lived until 1988. He never stopped drinking. He never stopped trying. He never quite became the man that the press and the television series and the legend wanted him to be. He was in the end just a man. He had been enough. After the war, the men on both sides put down their pencils and tried to make sense of what they had seen. Saburo Sakai, half-blind, returned to civilian life and wrote his memoir, published in Japanese in 1957. He spent the rest of his life telling Japanese audiences that war was the worst thing humanity had ever invented. He died in the year 2000 at the age of 84. Tetsuzo Iwamoto survived the war and published his journal after his death. He died in 1955 at the age of 38 from complications of an old wartime injury. He had flown over 200 sorties. He had been shot down only once. Jiro Horikoshi, the engineer who had designed the Zero, lived until 1982. He wrote, in his own memoir, that he had built an elegant solution for a nation that had lacked the resources to win the war it had chosen to fight. He never expressed pride in what his aircraft had done. He never expressed regret either. He had built what he had been asked to build. The F4U Corsair stayed in production until 1953. It served in Korea. It flew its last combat missions in 1969, in a brief and largely forgotten war between Honduras and El Salvador. More than 12,500 Corsairs were built by Vought, Goodyear and Brewster between 1940 and 1953. The Mitsubishi A6M0 ended production in 1945. Just over 10,400 Zeros were built. But the deeper truth, the truth that would matter long after the airplanes were melted into scrap, was that the Corsair had not really defeated the Zero on its own. The Corsair had been the visible weapon of an invisible victory. The invisible victory belonged to the American shipyards that had commissioned 6 new fleet carriers and 9 light carriers in 1943 alone. It belonged to the Pratt & Whitney engineers in Connecticut who had figured out how to mass-produce 2,000 horsepower engines on an assembly line. It belonged to the flight instructors in Pensacola and Corpus Christi who had trained tens of thousands of naval aviators in a single year. It belonged to a system, a democratic industrial mass production system, that could build, train, deploy and replace at a scale no totalitarian empire in history had ever matched. The Zero had been beautiful, the Corsair had been better, but what the Corsair really represented, what its bent wings and its huge engine and its rough marine pilots really stood for, was a way of building a nation that could, when pressed, outproduce and outlearn and outfacture any opponent in the world. That lesson did not vanish with the war. Japan studied it. Japan rebuilt. By the 1970s, the same nation that had built the Zero was building Toyotas. The same engineers who had once stripped weight from fighter planes to compensate for industrial poverty were now stripping weight from automobiles for fuel efficiency. The country that had been broken by American mass production became within 30 years the second largest economy on Earth, partly by adopting the very philosophy that had killed thousands of its naval aviators in the air over the Pacific. The Corsair had not just shot down the Zero, it had shot down a way of thinking, it had shot down an idea, the idea that warrior spirit could substitute for industrial capacity, that quality could overcome quantity, that elegance could defeat abundance. In the world that came after the war, abundance won. It is still winning. The pilots who flew the Corsair never forgot that they had been the lucky ones. They had flown the better aircraft. They had been trained longer. They had come home to a country that had won. The men they had killed had been just as brave as they were, just as devoted, just as willing to die for a flag that had no industrial economy strong enough to keep them alive. The American who had survived the Pacific knew this. The Japanese who had survived knew it too. That is why, when they met again decades later, at squadron reunions, at air shows, at the memorial dedications in Hawaii and Tokyo, they shook hands quietly and did not speak about the war very much. They had been on opposite sides of the same hard lesson. The lesson had been this: in the modern world, the nation that builds best, teaches best, and produces best, wins. In war and in peace the rule is the same. The Japanese pilots who never expected the F4U Corsair to rout their Zero squadrons learned that rule at terrible cost. The lesson is still in the textbooks. It is still in the wreckage at the bottom of the Solomon Sea. It is still in the photographs hanging in the Smithsonian, in the journal of Tetsuzo Iwamoto, in the Medal of Honor that hung around the neck of a 32-year-old Marine in October of 1945. The lesson does not change. The world has only kept on proving it.